3 summers ago, my friends and I decided to do something adventurous for our yearly get-together. We were all in our mid-20s, just starting our careers, so we thought a big camping trip would be the perfect break. I suggested the Bighorn Mountains in Wyoming. None of us had hiked there before, and it was far enough from any cities that we'd feel like we were truly out in the wilderness. We set off from Denver early on a Wednesday, thinking we'd beat the weekend crowds and have more of the trails to ourselves. Our group was made up of 4 people: myself, my best friend from college, and 2 buddies I'd known since high school. We were all pretty experienced campers with several trips together already under our belts, so we came prepared with supplies for a few nights in the backcountry. The hike-in was amazing. The air felt different up there, crisp and clean, like we'd left the rest of the world behind. The first day, we didn't see another person after we left the trailhead. It was almost eerie, but also peaceful. We set up camp near a small stream in a secluded area with a clearing that would be easy to spot from a distance just in case we got lost. That first night was quiet, uneventful, the way we'd hoped. But on the second night, things started to get strange. It was about dusk when we noticed 2 other hikers a ways down the trail from us. We didn't think much of it at first. They were both men, probably in their 30s or 40s, and looked pretty rugged, the type you'd expect to see out in the backcountry. But as they got closer, I realized they weren't just passing by. They were headed straight toward us, even though we were off the main trail. As they came up, one of them muttered something like "nice spot" without making eye contact, and they wandered off to the other side of the clearing. We figured they'd just set up camp nearby, even though there was plenty of space around for them to have picked somewhere less obvious. But they didn't actually set up a tent or anything. They just lingered, hanging around the edge of the clearing, not saying much. One of my friends gave a casual wave, but they just stood there, staring for a while before moving out of sight. That night, we all joked around the fire about how weird those guys were. The whole time, though, I couldn't shake a creeping feeling of discomfort. Every little sound in the woods felt amplified, and it seemed like those guys might be lurking just out of sight. After a couple of hours, we finally let our nerves settle and crashed in our tents, each of us still a little on edge, but trying not to make a big deal out of it. The next morning, I was the first to wake up. When I crawled out of my tent, I noticed something odd. A piece of paper stuck to a nearby tree. At first, I thought it was some kind of trail marker or maybe a forgotten note from a previous hiker. But when I pulled it down, I realized it was handwritten. The note said, "We'll see you again soon." No signature, no explanation. Just those words scrawled in what looked like charcoal or dirt. I showed it to the others and we all laughed it off, figuring it was probably some sick joke by those guys we'd seen the night before. It felt unsettling, but we brushed it off. After all, the wilderness attracts all kinds of people, and we'd come across our fair share of eccentric types on other hikes. We didn't let it ruin our plans, and we decided to move camp just to be cautious, setting up a couple of miles down the trail. The second night was tense. Every noise had us on high alert. We didn't light a fire, thinking it would be better to keep our presence less obvious, just in case someone was messing with us. We tried to relax and get some sleep, but around midnight we heard footsteps again. They were slow and deliberate, like someone was creeping through the underbrush, careful to avoid breaking twigs. We huddled in our tents, listening, every sound piercing the silence. The footsteps circled around our camp, pausing every so often. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I lay there, straining to hear. Then, just as suddenly as they'd started, they stopped. We stayed frozen in place, too afraid to even whisper to each other. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, we drifted off, more out of exhaustion than comfort. In the morning, there were no obvious signs that anyone had been there. But when we packed up our gear, I noticed another note pinned to a tree nearby. It said, "Don't get too comfortable." This time, the fear started to set in. It was clear that someone was deliberately watching us, following us as we moved camps. We debated whether we should cut the trip short and head back, but we were already miles into the back country, and the thought of heading back immediately seemed like an overreaction. We kept moving, hoping we'd shake them off if we went deeper into the woods. We pushed harder that day, covering more ground than we'd planned, hoping distance would keep us safe. We finally settled on a spot near a rocky outcrop, where we could at least see anyone approaching from one direction. We all kept watch for signs of movement, but the rest of the day passed without incident. That night, though, was when things escalated. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of something heavy hitting the ground outside our tents. I lay there, holding my breath, as I listened to someone, or something, pacing around the camp. My mind raced, wondering if it was those same 2 men from before, or maybe even more of them now. Then I heard what sounded like a scratching noise, like someone was dragging something sharp across the surface of one of the tents. I dared not move, afraid of drawing attention to myself. The scratching moved around to each tent in turn, lingering just long enough to keep us on edge. When it stopped, I felt a rush of relief, thinking they'd finally left. But then came the unmistakable sound of a rock thudding against one of the tent walls. It wasn't thrown with much force, but it was deliberate, as if they wanted to let us know they were still there. Another rock hit, and then another. Eventually, the sounds faded and silence returned. None of us slept after that. We packed up at dawn, deciding to make a break for it. As we got ready to leave, we found another note pinned to a tree just outside the camp. It read, "You can run, but you can't hide." We didn't waste time speculating. We just started hiking as fast as we could, barely stopping for breaks. The last stretch of the trail felt like a nightmare. We kept looking over our shoulders, half expecting those guys to appear out of the trees. By the time we made it back to the trailhead, we were exhausted, physically and mentally. The parking lot was empty, which meant there were no witnesses, no one we could turn to if something went wrong. We practically ran to the car, throwing our gear in as quickly as possible. Once we hit the road, the tension started to ease, though the experience left us all deeply shaken. We still talk about it sometimes, wondering who those men were, what they wanted, and how far they would have gone if we'd stayed another night. It's left me with a sense of dread that I can't shake even now, years later. I haven't been able to go back to the Bighorns or anywhere that remote since. I was alone in the woods when someone tried to unzip my tent in the middle of the night. I was always one for solo camping trips. I'd been doing them since college, and by now I'd developed a bit of a routine. I'd hit the trails, get a campsite set up, cook a quick meal, and spend the evening just me and the stars. I didn't go too far off the beaten path, but I liked the solitude. A few months back, I decided to try somewhere new. I'd read about this secluded camping area in the Adirondacks near Keene Valley, New York, tucked deep enough into the woods that you wouldn't see another soul. It sounded perfect for a weekend getaway, so I packed my gear, drove up, and set out with my mind set on a peaceful weekend. The trail was quiet, as I expected, and the hike in went smoothly. I found a decent spot a couple miles from the trailhead, close enough to a small clearing where I'd have a view of the stars, but surrounded by enough trees to feel sheltered. It was autumn, so the leaves were mostly fallen, and the branches looked dark and skeletal, but I liked the eerie stillness of it. I pitched my tent as the sun began to dip behind the trees. casting long shadows that made the forest seem to close in around me. I had that odd, heady mix of feeling completely alone and totally vulnerable, which was kind of the point for me. The whole point of camping out there was to feel like I was really out in the wild. The first night was calm, but I was aware of every sound. A squirrel skittering across leaves, a branch creaking in the wind. In a way, it was comforting, just me and the sounds of the forest. I eventually fell asleep with my flashlight clutched in my hand, just in case. The next day was uneventful. I hiked a bit, explored some nearby trails, then returned to my campsite to relax. By sundown, I was back at my tent, ready to make a quick meal and settle in for the night. I had a small fire going, enough to stay warm but not too big, as I didn't want to attract attention if there was anyone even out there to notice. Around 10 or 11, I decided to call it a night. I put out the fire, crawled into my sleeping bag, and zipped myself up in my tent. I don't know exactly what time I woke up, but I remember it was pitch dark. I hadn't heard anything at first. I was just awake, aware, and slightly uneasy. The kind of feeling that makes you lie still and strain your ears to hear something that isn't there. I lay there, listening to the absolute silence outside. No rustling of leaves, no branches creaking, nothing. Just silence. Then I heard it. The faintest sound like fabric being tugged. I froze, my whole body going rigid. I thought it was the wind at first, or maybe an animal nosing around outside. But then it came again. This soft, tugging sound. And that's when I realized it was coming from right at the entrance of my tent. The zipper. Someone was touching the zipper of my tent. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I could feel my heartbeat throbbing in my ears, deafeningly loud in the silence. I had a knife tucked into my boot, but it felt miles away. I couldn't reach for it without making noise, and whoever was outside would hear me. I just lay there, hoping, praying that it was all in my head. But I knew I wasn't imagining it. The sound of the zipper was unmistakable. It was slow at first, like whoever was out there was trying to be quiet. A gentle, deliberate tugging that moved the zipper down just an inch at a time. I couldn't tell how much had been opened, but I knew they weren't trying to get in quickly. It felt like they were testing the waters, seeing if I was awake. I shut my eyes and tried to breathe as softly as possible, hoping that they'd think I was asleep and just leave. But they didn't leave. The zipper moved again, another inch. My mind raced with 100 horrible thoughts. Was it a thief? A random person who stumbled upon my tent? Or was it someone who'd been watching me since I arrived? I lay there, listening, terrified of what I might hear next. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the zipper stopped. There was silence again. I waited, straining to hear any sound. I was sure whoever was out there was still close. I listened for footsteps, for any sign of retreat, but there was nothing. For what felt like hours, I stayed perfectly still, my body tense and my mind running wild with paranoia. I thought maybe they were standing right outside, listening for me, waiting to see if I'd make a move. Eventually, I must have dozed off from sheer exhaustion because when I opened my eyes, the first light of dawn was starting to filter through the trees. My muscles were sore from staying tense all night, and I realized I hadn't moved an inch. I slowly, carefully unzipped the tent, my hands shaking as I peeked outside. Nothing seemed out of place. The forest was quiet, still wrapped in the early morning mist. I got out of my tent, my eyes scanning the surroundings. That's when I saw them, faint but clear. Footprints in the dirt, leading from the trail straight to my tent, stopping just outside the entrance. I checked my gear, my food, everything. Nothing was missing, no signs of disturbance other than those footprints. It was as if someone had come, opened the zipper, and then just left. I couldn't understand it. I'd camped alone dozens of times, but this was the first time I'd ever felt genuinely threatened. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, my eyes darting into the trees as I worked. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like whoever had been there might be watching me still. I didn't bother with breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back felt twice as long as the hike in. Every crunch of leaves under my feet felt like it echoed through the entire forest. And I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there watching. When I finally got back to my car, I threw my stuff in the trunk and locked the doors, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. But even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my bones. It wasn't just the encounter itself. It was the thought of how close I'd come to a situation I might not have been able to control. The idea that, in the middle of nowhere, there was no one to hear me, no one to help if things had gone wrong. I haven't been back to that campsite since. I still camp alone, but I stick to more populated areas now, places where there are at least a few other people around. It's been a while since that night, but every time I pitch my tent, I still find myself listening for any sound out of place, any hint of footsteps outside. Last year, my son and I went on a camping trip that I thought would be the adventure of a lifetime for us both. We're both big on the outdoors and had done plenty of camping in more populated areas. But this time, I wanted us to have a true wilderness experience somewhere quieter, deeper into nature. We decided to go to the Appalachian Mountains, specifically to a more remote area of Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. I'd read up on the area, looked at maps, and figured we'd be fine if we stuck to the general route I'd planned. Little did I know that we'd spend the next 3 nights feeling like we were constantly on the edge of some terrifying event that never quite happened. The first day was normal as it gets for being in the middle of the woods. We'd left the main trails and started into the back country, aiming to get a couple of miles in and set up camp before dusk. Everything seemed fine. The forest was dense, quiet, peaceful. We didn't run into a single person after we left the main path, and that's exactly what I'd wanted. Just my son and me, surrounded by nothing but the sounds of nature. We reached a spot I'd marked on my map that looked perfect. A small clearing surrounded by tall trees with enough open space for the tent and a fire pit. After setting up camp, we cooked dinner over a small fire and spent the rest of the evening just talking, laughing, and watching the stars come out. Around 10 p.m., we finally decided to call it a night and retreated to the tent. It was quiet, almost eerily so, but I chalked it up to the remoteness of the place. In the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I lay still, listening for a moment, and then I heard it. A distinct snap, like someone stepping on a twig. I rationalized it could be an animal, a deer, maybe a raccoon. But the strange part was that the sound didn't stop. There were multiple footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving just outside our tent. I lay there, heart pounding, not wanting to wake my son or alarm him unless I was sure it was something to worry about. The footsteps circled the campsite, and then everything went silent again. The next morning, I checked the area around our campsite looking for tracks or signs of whatever had made those sounds. I found nothing conclusive. Maybe a few disturbed leaves, but it could have been anything. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, or maybe a curious animal that had wandered too close. I didn't mention it to my son. I didn't want to spook him, and we'd come all this way to enjoy ourselves. We spent the day hiking farther into the woods, exploring and taking photos of the scenery. By the time we got back to camp that evening, we were both exhausted. We ate dinner and went to bed early, hoping for a good night's sleep after a long day. But just like the night before, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. This time, they were closer, and they sounded more purposeful. I could tell from the rhythm that it was definitely not an animal. Whoever it was, they were walking slowly around our tent, pausing every few steps as if listening or looking for something. I stayed as still as possible, hoping they'd just leave. The footsteps eventually faded into the distance, and I lay awake for what felt like hours, listening for any other noises. I barely slept after that, my ears tuned to every little sound outside the tent. By morning, I was exhausted, and my son noticed. He asked if something was wrong, and I brushed it off, telling him I'd just had trouble sleeping. That day, I started to wonder if maybe someone was out here messing with us. Maybe we'd wandered too close to some hunter's spot. Or there was another camper out there who didn't appreciate the company. But we hadn't seen anyone since we'd left the main trail, and I hadn't heard any other campers or hikers. The idea that we might not be alone started to make me uneasy, but I didn't want to turn back just yet. I'd planned 3 nights, and part of me still hoped it was just my mind playing tricks on me. That night, I was even more on edge. I lay awake for hours, listening intently. The forest was dead silent, almost unnaturally so. Then around 2 a.m., I heard it again. The slow, deliberate footsteps circling the tent. They were closer this time, and I felt my son stir beside me, starting to wake up. I put a hand on his shoulder, hoping he'd stay quiet. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent, and whoever it was stood there for what felt like an eternity. My son whispered, asking if I'd heard it too, and I nodded, trying to keep him calm. We both lay there, frozen, listening. After a few tense minutes, the footsteps started up again, retreating back into the woods. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as it was light out, I packed up our things, telling my son that we were moving campsites. He didn't argue. I think he was just as unnerved as I was. We hiked for miles, hoping to put as much distance as possible between us and whoever or whatever had been visiting our campsite at night. We set up camp in a different clearing, far off from where we'd been before. But that night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, more persistent, as if whoever was out there knew we'd tried to get away. They circled the tent multiple times, stopping every so often. My son clung to me, and I tried to keep him calm, telling him we'd leave first thing in the morning. The next day, we packed up and hiked back to the main trail as quickly as possible, barely stopping to rest. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following us, but we never did. When we finally made it back to the car, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I didn't care about finding out who or what had been out there. I just wanted to get as far away as possible. I haven't been camping since, and I don't know if I ever will. Every time I think about those nights in the woods, I get that same creeping feeling of dread. Whatever or whoever was out there with us, they weren't there by accident, and they weren't just passing by. Our camping trip turned sinister when we realized someone was messing with our supplies, and it wasn't just animals. Camping had always been my thing. I grew up spending weekends in the woods with family, so when my girlfriend suggested a camping trip in the Ozarks, I was all for it. We drove down from Kansas City to an area near the Buffalo National River, just south of Ponca, Arkansas. It's a beautiful, remote spot with rugged cliffs and thick forests. We packed light, bringing just enough supplies for a couple of days, ready for a peaceful time away from everything. The first day was fantastic. We hiked to a scenic overlook, took in the view, then found a secluded spot to set up camp a bit off the trail. It was perfect, a small clearing surrounded by dense trees, completely out of sight from any other campers. The only sound was the wind through the leaves and the distant call of birds. We had a small campfire, ate our packed food, and settled into our tent under a clear sky, feeling like we'd found our own little slice of paradise. When we woke up the next morning, the first thing I noticed was that our food bag, which I'd hung from a tree to keep animals away, was gone. I figured maybe I hadn't secured it well enough, and an animal had managed to get it down. But when I checked around, there was no sign of torn packaging or food scraps that you'd expect if a raccoon or some other critter had gotten into it. The whole bag was just gone, like someone had taken it down and walked off with it. I started to get a weird feeling about it. Sure, it could have been an animal, but this was different. I tried not to let it bother me too much and brushed it off, telling myself we could make do with the snacks we still had in the tent and whatever we could catch or forage. We spent the day hiking further into the woods, exploring, and even managed to catch a couple of fish from a stream nearby. By the time we got back to the campsite, the light was starting to fade. I set up another fire, cooked the fish, and we spent the evening relaxing and talking. As it got dark, the forest around us seemed to close in, the trees casting long, eerie shadows in the firelight. We stayed up for a while, but eventually, the long day caught up to us, and we went to bed feeling tired but relaxed. But then, in the dead of night, I woke up to a sound. At first I thought I was dreaming, but then I heard it again. Faint laughter coming from somewhere in the woods. It was distant but unmistakable, and it didn't sound like kids playing or someone laughing around a campfire. It was more like taunting, like someone was purposely trying to mess with us. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to listen, but after a few minutes the sound faded away. I told myself it was probably just a group of hikers nearby, but the laughter had been so unsettling I couldn't fall back asleep right away. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I dozed off, telling myself it was nothing. The next morning, things were worse. We found more items out of place, scattered around like someone had been rummaging through our things while we slept. Our water bottles, which I'd left next to the fire pit, were lying several feet away, and the small camp shovel we'd brought was propped against a tree like someone had placed it there on purpose. I started to get a sinking feeling in my stomach. Animals don't do that. I didn't want to scare my girlfriend, so I downplayed it, telling her I must have been careless when I put things away last night. We spent that day sticking close to the campsite, mostly because I wanted to keep an eye on things. But the peace we'd felt when we first arrived was gone. I felt jumpy, like there were eyes on us from somewhere in the dense trees, even though I kept looking around and seeing nothing. Every time a branch snapped or a leaf rustled, my heart skipped a beat. I was kicking myself for not bringing something more than a knife for protection. But we'd planned this as a relaxed trip, just the two of us in the quiet woods. I hadn't thought we'd need anything more. That night, I set up a few small traps around the campsite using some string and sticks, hoping it would at least alert me if something or someone approached. We went to bed, both of us pretending we weren't as on edge as we felt. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a rustling sound, followed by the faint snap of one of my makeshift alarms. My girlfriend was still asleep, and I sat up, trying to calm my racing heart, listening as hard as I could. Then I heard it. Whispering. It was faint, like two people whispering back and forth just beyond the tent. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was clear, almost mocking, like they were talking about us, like they knew we were lying awake, terrified inside our tent. I didn't dare move. I just sat there, gripping the knife I'd placed beside me, every muscle tense as I tried to figure out what to do. After a few minutes, the whispering stopped, and I heard the sound of footsteps retreating into the forest, fading into the distance. I stayed awake the rest of the night, barely breathing, afraid that any noise would draw them back. When dawn finally broke, I stepped outside, gripping the knife tightly, ready for anything. The campsite was a mess. Our remaining food was gone, our gear scattered around as if someone had gone through it piece by piece, looking for anything they could take or mess with. My girlfriend was visibly shaken, and I could tell she'd been trying to keep it together for my sake. I told her we needed to pack up and leave as quickly as possible. As we were gathering our things, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, in the dirt near the edge of our campsite, were footprints. They were clear, unmistakably human, leading from the trees right up to our tent and then back out again. The realization that someone had been that close, watching us, listening to us, was enough to send a fresh wave of panic through me. We packed up in record time and started the long hike back to the car. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following us, though I never did. The entire walk back, I felt that unsettling sensation, like we were being herded out of the forest. Even after we finally made it back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were leaving under someone else's terms, that we'd been allowed to go. Looking back on it, I still get chills. It wasn't just the missing food or the scattered gear. It was the laughter, the whispering, the fact that they were there, just outside our tent, listening. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I do know this. They were enjoying themselves. That abandoned cabin we stumbled into to escape a storm wasn't nearly as empty as it seemed. A few years ago, my friend Ryan and I took a road trip from Los Angeles to explore some of the wilderness areas in Northern California. We planned to hike through the Shasta Trinity National Forest, camp along the trails, and just get a break from everything. It was early fall, the kind of weather where it was still warm during the day but got pretty chilly at night. We'd planned to camp most nights, but things didn't go quite as smoothly as we'd hoped. On the third day of our trip, the weather took a turn. We checked the forecast, and while it had said there was a chance of rain, we hadn't anticipated a full-on storm. By the time we'd started back toward the trailhead, it was pouring and the temperature was dropping quickly. The trail was getting slippery and we were already soaked through. We didn't see much of a choice but to keep moving and hope we'd find some kind of shelter. After about an hour of slogging through the rain, we saw a cabin off the main path, tucked back behind a line of trees. At first it looked like it might be abandoned, but the sight of any structure was a relief. We both looked at each other and didn't even need to discuss it. We headed straight for it, hoping to find a bit of shelter from the cold and the storm. As we got closer, the cabin looked run down but intact, like it might still be solid enough to keep us dry for the night. The windows were grimy, some of them cracked, and the front door hung slightly open, creaking with each gust of wind. I hesitated as I reached the door, wondering if maybe someone else was staying here. But when we looked around, it was clear the place was empty. The inside was dusty, with old, splintered furniture and a faint, musty smell like it hadn't been used in years. The cabin had a single room with a couple of broken chairs, an old table, and a fireplace that hadn't seen a fire in a long time. There were remnants of someone's stuff lying around: an old, moldy sleeping bag, some cans that were rusted shut, and a stack of magazines from what looked like decades ago. It wasn't much, but it was dry, and after the hours we'd spent in the downpour, it felt like a stroke of luck to have stumbled across it. We put our packs down and set about trying to get a fire going in the fireplace, though it wasn't easy given how damp we were. Eventually, we managed to get a small flame going and sat close to it, warming up and trying to dry our clothes as best we could. Outside, the rain continued to pound against the roof, and the wind howled, shaking the cabin every so often. It was eerie, but we were just glad to be out of the storm. A few hours passed, and we were starting to relax a bit, feeling like we could actually get some rest. Ryan unrolled his sleeping bag by the fire, and I decided to take a quick look around outside, just to make sure there wasn't anything we'd missed. I took my flashlight and stepped out into the rain, circling around the cabin. The place was definitely abandoned, with overgrown weeds surrounding it, and there were no recent signs of anyone else being there. I figured we were alone and went back inside. We both lay down, and despite the discomfort of the hard floor and the lingering chill in the air, I started to drift off. That was until I heard it, a loud bang, like someone slamming a fist against the outside wall of the cabin. I sat up, my heart pounding, glancing over at Ryan, who was now wide awake too. We waited, holding our breath, listening to the storm and straining for any other sounds. For a while, nothing happened. The banging stopped as suddenly as it had started, and we tried to calm ourselves down, telling each other that it was probably just something blowing in the wind. But even as we said it, I didn't really believe it. The sound had been too deliberate, too loud to be random. We stayed awake, eyes on the door, our flashlights ready in case something else happened. Another hour or so passed, and we were still on edge, neither of us able to fall asleep. Then, out of nowhere, the banging started up again, even louder this time, as if someone was slamming on the walls with both hands, going all around the outside of the cabin. The sound echoed through the small space, filling every corner, and the whole cabin seemed to shake with each hit. We both scrambled up, grabbing our flashlights, and Ryan whispered that maybe we should just leave, storm or not. But going out into the rain and dark, especially with whoever or whatever was out there, didn't feel much safer. We stood there, frozen, listening as the banging stopped yet again. Everything went quiet for a few minutes, just the sound of the rain and our own breathing. And I started to think maybe it was over. But then, I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate, like someone pacing just outside the door. I shone my flashlight toward it, half expecting to see someone burst through, but the door stayed closed. The footsteps moved back and forth, and I could feel my heart pounding, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. I didn't dare open the door or look out the window. Whoever was out there wasn't saying a word, just walking back and forth, occasionally stopping and tapping lightly on the window. Hours passed, though it felt like forever, and finally the footsteps faded. The rain started to ease up, and we just sat there, too afraid to move or even speak. As dawn approached, the storm had completely stopped, and the first light crept through the cracks in the cabin walls. We waited until the sun was fully up before gathering our things, not daring to open the door until we were sure it was safe. When we finally stepped outside, the forest was calm, the ground soaked from the night storm. I looked around, half expecting to see someone hiding nearby, but there was no one. The only sign that anything had happened was a series of muddy footprints circling the cabin, leading from one window to the next, and then out into the trees. They were fresh, slightly smudged from the rain, but unmistakable. We didn't waste any time getting back to the car. Even now, thinking back on it, I don't know who or what was outside that cabin with us that night. All I know is that it wasn't some animal, and it wasn't just the wind. We weren't alone, and I still get chills every time I remember that slow, deliberate pacing on the porch. I've always loved hiking alone, just me, my thoughts, and the quiet of the forest. A couple of years back, I decided to take a solo trip to the Ozark National Forest in Arkansas. I wanted to get away from the usual crowded trails and explore some more secluded areas. I had done a lot of research, pored over maps, and planned out a route that would take me pretty far off the beaten path, which is exactly what I wanted. The idea of having the forest all to myself was the perfect escape, or so I thought. After driving out to a remote trailhead and hiking for a few hours, I set up camp near a stream where I spent my first night. The forest was dense, beautiful, and eerily quiet. The next morning, I packed up my gear and continued hiking deeper into the woods, following a narrow, barely there trail I'd marked on my map. I was keeping an eye out for any signs of wildlife, though in all honesty, I hadn't seen much of anything so far. Just trees, rocks, and the endless stretch of forest. By midday, I'd made it to a part of the forest that felt particularly untouched. It was hard to tell if anyone had been through here in years. The trail was barely visible, overgrown with shrubs and tall grass. I pushed forward, occasionally stopping to check my map, but confident I knew where I was going. That confidence was shattered in an instant. 1 second I was moving along as normal, and the next I felt a sudden, sharp pain around my ankle as something yanked me down. I didn't even have time to react before I was flat on my back, staring up at the sky in shock, my leg burning with pain. I looked down and saw that my foot had triggered some kind of snare. A thick, rusted wire looped around my ankle, cutting into my skin. Whoever had set this trap had done it deliberately, and it was strong enough to hold me there, struggling and helpless. For a few minutes I just lay there, stunned, trying to catch my breath. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the blood pulsing around the wire. The pain was bad, but the fear was worse. I kept thinking about how far I was from any help, how no one knew exactly where I was, and how I might have to free myself from this trap. But I wasn't sure how. I tried to pull at the wire, but every tug only made it dig deeper into my skin. My ankle was throbbing, and I could feel the warmth of blood trickling down my leg. I took a few deep breaths and tried to think logically. First things first, I needed to get this snare off. I reached for my pack, which had fallen a few feet away, and managed to drag it closer. I dug through it, looking for my multi-tool, hoping I could cut through the wire. But as I started working on it, I realized it was no use. The wire was thick, rusted, and too strong for my small blade to cut through. That's when I started to panic. I was miles away from anyone, trapped in the middle of the forest, with a bleeding ankle and no way to get free. I tried calling for help, shouting into the trees, but my voice just echoed back at me, swallowed up by the dense woods. I felt like an animal caught in a trap, waiting for something or someone to find me. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to come up with a plan. My ankle was swollen and raw by this point, the wire cutting in deeper with every movement. I felt dizzy, lightheaded, maybe from the blood loss or just pure exhaustion. I didn't have any real supplies to treat an injury like this, just a basic first aid kit with a few bandages and antiseptic wipes. And none of it would help until I was actually free from the snare. As the sun started to dip lower, I felt a growing sense of dread. Night was coming, and I was still stuck, helpless and vulnerable. Every little sound in the forest seemed louder, more ominous. I kept thinking about who might have set the trap, why it was there, and what would happen if they came back. The idea that someone had deliberately put this here, waiting for an animal or a person to get caught, made my skin crawl. At some point, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps crunching on the forest floor. It was faint, but definitely there, coming closer. My heart skipped a beat and I held my breath, trying to stay as still as possible, hoping whoever it was wouldn't notice me. But the footsteps kept coming, slow and deliberate, until they were just beyond the trees. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel their presence, lurking just out of sight. I stayed as quiet as I could, barely breathing, waiting for them to pass. But they didn't. Instead, the footsteps stopped and the forest went completely silent, as if whoever was out there was just standing still, watching me. After a long, agonizing moment, the footsteps started again, retreating back into the woods. I didn't dare move or make a sound until they were completely gone. When the silence finally returned, I let out a shaky breath, feeling a mix of relief and terror. I didn't know who it was or why they were out here, but it was clear I wasn't alone. The rest of the night was a blur. I was too scared to sleep, too exhausted to keep struggling against the snare. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear those footsteps again, replaying in my mind, a reminder that someone had been out there, just watching me. I kept my multi-tool in my hand, gripping it like a lifeline, even though I knew it was useless against the wire. All I could do was wait for morning, hoping the daylight would bring some kind of solution. When dawn finally broke, I felt a wave of relief, though it was short-lived. My ankle was swollen and bruised, the skin raw and bloody where the wire had cut in. I knew I had to get out of there, and fast. I managed to maneuver myself enough to get my pack under me for support and tried to think of a way to loosen the snare. After several failed attempts, I finally managed to wedge a stick between the wire and my skin, creating just enough space to wiggle my foot free. The pain was intense, but the relief of being free was worth it. I didn't waste any time after that. I hobbled back in the direction I'd come, leaning on my pack for support, every step sending sharp jolts of pain up my leg. I didn't look back, didn't stop to rest. I just kept moving, determined to put as much distance as possible between me and that trap. Eventually, I made it back to the trailhead, exhausted, limping, and covered in dirt and sweat. I never did find out who set that trap or why, but the experience left me with a lingering fear of going off trail. The forest no longer felt like a place of peace and solitude, but something darker, unpredictable, where danger could be lurking around any corner. I thought we lost our son in the Canadian wilderness, but the real horror started when we found him. I grew up camping in Canada. My parents would take us to places like Algonquin and Jasper, and I grew up loving everything about it. The quiet, the smell of the trees, the campfire crackling in the night. When I had a family of my own, I knew I wanted to pass on those experiences to my kids, hoping they'd grow up with the same love for the wilderness that I had. So, when our son turned 5, my wife and I decided to take him on a family camping trip near Wabakimi Provincial Park in Ontario, a place remote enough to feel truly wild, but with a couple of basic campgrounds around. It was early autumn, and the weather was perfect. Not too cold yet, but with a crispness that made everything feel alive. We drove up, excited for the break from daily life, and set up our tent near a small lake just outside the park boundary. There were no other people at our site or in the general area, as far as we could tell. The forest around us was quiet, occasionally stirred by the distant cry of a loon or the rustling of leaves in the breeze. It felt like we were in our own little world, which was exactly what I had hoped for. That first day went perfectly. We spent time teaching our son how to build a fire, showing him how to skip rocks on the lake, and doing all the usual camping things. He was a bit restless during the night, tossing and turning in his sleeping bag, but it was nothing unusual. I figured it was just the excitement of being out in the wilderness. We went to sleep feeling content, totally at ease. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to the faint sound of footsteps outside the tent. At first, I assumed it was an animal, a raccoon, or maybe a fox. I wasn't alarmed. Animals come by campsites all the time. But as I lay there, I realized these footsteps didn't have the erratic pace of an animal scrounging around. They were slow, deliberate, moving around the tent like someone was circling it, pausing every few steps. I was about to wake my wife when the footsteps stopped. I lay there, ears straining for any sound, but everything had gone silent. After a few minutes, I convinced myself that it must have been my imagination. The mind can play tricks on you in the silence of the woods, especially in the dead of night. I eventually fell back asleep, brushing it off as nothing. But then, just before dawn, my wife shook me awake, her voice tense and filled with panic. Our son wasn't in the tent. I sat up, groggy and disoriented, but her words sank in fast. He wasn't there. We scrambled out of our sleeping bags, checking the entire tent, but he was gone. I tried to calm her, hoping maybe he'd just wandered a few feet away to relieve himself, but in the pit of my stomach, I felt a rising dread. Outside, the first light of dawn barely lit the forest, casting everything in eerie, muted tones. We called his name, our voices growing louder, desperation creeping in. There was no response. We kept calling, scanning the trees and the underbrush, expecting him to pop out with that little grin he had when he knew he was being mischievous. But he didn't appear. Minutes turned into an hour, and I started feeling the weight of every second. We moved farther from the campsite, combing through the bushes and the small trail that led to the lake, calling for him over and over. And then faintly from somewhere deep in the woods we heard a cry, a small, thin wail that sounded like our son. We both froze, straining to listen, and heard it again. But the direction was impossible to pinpoint. It seemed to echo, bouncing off the trees and distant rocks. With our hearts pounding, we moved toward the sound, but as we got closer, it would fade, only to start up again somewhere else. It felt like he was everywhere and nowhere at once. As the hours stretched on, the crying stopped altogether. The forest returned to an unsettling quiet, every sound amplified, every shadow suspicious. We kept searching, combing the area methodically, circling back to our campsite and then venturing out in different directions. I couldn't shake the sense that someone else was there, watching us from the shadows, hidden just out of sight. Around noon, exhausted and nearing panic, we stumbled back to our campsite, defeated and afraid. I couldn't stop thinking about how we were hours from the nearest town, miles from any other campers, truly isolated. Just as I was beginning to consider packing up and driving out to find help, I saw something through the trees, something small and familiar lying near the edge of the camp. It was him, our son, curled up near the base of a tree, just beyond the clearing where our tent was. He was lying on his side, looking dazed but unharmed. I rushed to him, my heart pounding, terrified of what we might find. But he was okay, confused and a little cold, but completely unharmed. We bombarded him with questions, desperate to understand what had happened, but he had no answers. He couldn't remember how he got there or where he'd been. He was just as puzzled as we were. We wrapped him in a blanket, grateful beyond words that he was back. But the relief was mixed with a nagging unease. That was when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Fresh footprints around the campsite, circling it, weaving in and out of the trees. They weren't ours, and they definitely weren't made by an animal. They were deep, heavy, and unmistakably human, leading right to the spot where we'd found him. I spent the rest of the day on edge, trying to focus on taking care of my son and making my wife feel safe. But my mind kept circling back to those footsteps. The sheer isolation of our campsite hit me harder than ever. I kept going over every detail in my head, trying to make sense of it. Why would someone be out here so deep in the forest, just watching us? That night, I barely slept, lying awake and listening to every rustle, every snap of a twig. I felt helpless in a way I'd never experienced before. We were completely alone out here, hours from anyone who could help us, with no cell service, no one to call. The smallest sound made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, lurking just beyond the trees, hidden in the shadows. The next morning, we packed up as quickly as we could. My son was still quiet, as if he sensed our tension, and my wife kept glancing nervously at the tree line. As we loaded everything into the car, I took one last look around the campsite. The tracks were still there, faint but visible, a reminder of whoever or whatever had been watching us. On the drive back, none of us said much. We were all lost in our own thoughts, processing what had happened, trying to make sense of the fear that had taken hold of us. I'd always thought of the wilderness as a place of peace and beauty, but now, every time I close my eyes, I see those footprints circling our tent, and I wondered just how close we came to something far worse. I was trapped in an isolated storm shelter during a thunderstorm, but whoever locked us in wasn't there to help. Last summer, my friend Eric and I decided to go backpacking along the North Cascades in Washington. We'd both spent a lot of time in the outdoors, but this was supposed to be our longest, most remote trip yet. We'd mapped out a path, set up campsites along the trail, and packed for every situation we could think of. A couple of days in, we ended up near Ross Lake, which has some emergency storm shelters scattered along its trails. We didn't expect to use one. They're usually small, rough shacks, built mostly to get hikers out of rough weather if things turn bad. But that night, we had no choice. We were around 8 miles into a long day of hiking when the sky went from overcast to pitch black in what felt like minutes. We'd checked the weather before we left and hadn't expected a storm, but it hit us fast and hard. The first drops were barely hitting the ground before thunder started crashing overhead, so close that it felt like the ground shook each time. We both had rain gear, but the wind picked up fast, and the rain turned into sheets that felt more like needles with each gust. There wasn't a lot of cover on the path, just dense forest on either side, and we needed to find shelter quickly. Eric remembered seeing a sign for a nearby emergency shelter about a half-mile back. We turned around, hiking fast, practically jogging, trying to keep our balance as the trail turned to mud. Eventually, we spotted the shelter through the trees. It was a small, plain building, barely more than a shed with a solid wooden door and no windows. It looked rough, with a bit of mold creeping up the walls and a roof patched with mismatched shingles. But it was dry, and that was enough for us. The door creaked when we pushed it open, and we stumbled inside, dripping and out of breath. It wasn't much. Just a single wooden bench bolted to one wall and hooks on the other for gear. But it was solid, and it felt safe enough. We spread out our stuff, to dry and settled in, listening to the storm pound on the roof. It was loud in there with the rain hitting the tin roof like a drum. But we both felt an odd relief. In a place that empty, sometimes just having four walls and a door between you and the wilderness can make all the difference. After about an hour, though, things started to feel off. I was sitting on the bench, half dozing, while Eric was organizing his stuff in his pack. We were both dead tired from the hike, but the adrenaline from the storm was keeping us awake. Out of nowhere, we heard footsteps outside. They were slow and heavy, crunching on the gravel right outside the door. We both froze, looking at each other, trying to figure out if we'd actually heard it or if it was the storm playing tricks on us. But the footsteps kept coming, one after the other, until they stopped just outside the door. It was a weird feeling, standing there, not knowing who or what was out there. We were deep in the forest, miles from the nearest road, and we hadn't seen another person all day. For a second, I thought maybe it was a ranger checking up on the shelter, but it was well past dark, and no ranger would be out here at that hour in this weather. I stepped closer to the door, listening, trying to hear anything over the rain. Then we heard a faint metallic clink, like the sound of a lock or latch being moved. Before we could react, we heard the sound of a bolt sliding into place from the outside. Someone had locked us in. Eric shot me a look, his eyes wide. We rushed to the door, pushing against it, but it wouldn't budge. Whoever was out there had secured the lock on the outside, trapping us in. We yelled, pounding on the wood, but there was no response, no sound of footsteps leaving. Just silence and the relentless hammering of rain. It's hard to explain the kind of fear that sets in when you realize you're trapped like that, miles away from help, with someone out there who clearly didn't want you getting out. We tried everything, kicking, ramming the door, even trying to pry it open with a tent pole we had with us, but it wouldn't budge. The door was solid, reinforced with metal brackets, probably designed to withstand storms, and there was no window to break or crawl out of. Time passed, but we couldn't tell how much. It was still pitch black outside, and the storm didn't seem to be letting up. The inside of the shelter felt colder, more oppressive, like the air was getting sucked out of the room. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the sweat mixing with the dampness on my skin despite the cold. We kept listening, straining to hear any sound outside, but there was nothing. The storm was still roaring, the rain hammering on the roof. But whoever had locked us in was either long gone or waiting out there in the dark. At some point, we both slumped down against the walls, exhausted from pounding on the door. We didn't know what else to do. Part of me wanted to think it was some kind of prank. Maybe someone who'd come across the shelter and thought it'd be funny to mess with us. But out here, so far from anyone or anything, that didn't make sense. Even if it was a prank, there was no way to know when or if whoever did it would come back. After what felt like hours, the storm started to die down and the rain turned to a faint drizzle. We took turns ramming the door, trying to splinter the wood near the latch, but it barely moved. I'd started to lose hope when we heard a faint creaking like wood shifting. It was coming from the back of the shelter, where one of the boards along the floor was slightly loose. We pried at it, desperate for any way out, and managed to create a gap big enough to see the dirt underneath. It took both of us, working together, pulling and prying, but we eventually widened the gap enough to squeeze through, scraping our hands and arms raw in the process. We scrambled out, into the wet, muddy ground outside, adrenaline pushing us forward as we crawled through the underbrush, away from the shelter. We didn't stop moving until we reached the main trail. By the time we turned back to look at the shelter, there was no one there. No signs of anyone. just the small, dark shack against the trees, silent and unmoving. The walk back to our car the next morning felt like a blur. Neither of us spoke about it, and to this day, I don't know who or what trapped us in that shelter. There were no other hikers in the area, no rangers nearby, and the storm had covered any tracks that might have been left. All I know is that someone out there wanted us locked in that night, and for whatever reason they didn't want us to get out.